accessory dwelling units. And I guess we'll go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Zarneski.
Thank you. I'm going to try to get control of my screen here, and then we'll get started. There we go. All right, thanks a lot. So the goal of this presentation is to share with you a little bit about accessory dwelling units in general, and then specifically about some of the code amendments being recommended by the Planning Commission. So we'll cover ADUs plus a number of other sections of code needing amendments and housekeeping that are related to the development of our community. And at your next meeting is when these ADU changes will be introduced for your consideration. So a little bit of background. There has been a fair amount of interest historically from the public on this topic. I was looking through my old folder here on accessory dwelling units and tiny homes, and I've got some emails from 2015 that where people are inquiring about building smaller homes within the city. And so that's kind of come and gone through the years. There's always been a little bit of interest here and there. And in another case, I remember a gentleman wanting to build an accessory dwelling unit for his son. Our code, as it currently stands, would allow that, but would require him to have only a one-bedroom unit, and he could not charge rent under our code. If his son were to leave, he'd have this unit then that would be unrentable because unless he gives it away. So anyway, there has been some interest in this topic historically. And then we have a comp plan goal to promote and encourage housing diversity for people of all ages, income, and household size. So this fits well with that goal in our comprehensive plan. As I mentioned, the Planning Commission did meet and work on this. They had a work session on July 6th where they considered and debated many changes and the adoption of several different elements of this code. And then on August 3rd, they actually held their hearing and passed the resolution for your consideration. So this presentation, again, reflects their recommendations as well as a little bit of background on ADUs in general. So ADUs, typically smaller in size than your principal dwelling. The idea is to try to preserve yards and open space. So that top right photo is an example of an ADU. A detached ADU. The bottom right shows the idea of trying to preserve neighborhood character through the preservation of yards, keeping yard spaces and setbacks intact. So the idea is that they're small enough so they don't disrupt neighborhood character, community character. That's the concept that the Planning Commission in particular was trying to get after is, what can we allow but still allow for our neighborhoods to retain that neighborhood character. So purpose and intent. So this reflects what we're trying to get across in the ordinance to allow more efficient and flexible use of our existing resources, basically. We've got all this existing infrastructure already in the ground. Are there opportunities to tap into it and create additional housing units? Secondly, this is an opportunity to respond to changing community demographics. We can serve smaller households and provide a mix of housing options. I myself am soon to become a single person household. My daughter is leaving for college tomorrow, and so who knows, I may be in the market for one of these. Third, provide a broader range of accessible and more affordable housing choices within the city. And that's, again, reflective of our goal within the comp plan. And then protect neighborhood stability, property values, and single-family residential appearance by ensuring that accessory dwelling units are installed under the provisions of this title. So what I've listed there for you is just a handful of some of the sections of code that ADUs will touch. So when we drafted this section on ADU code, it really does affect many other portions of our code. And we'll go through some of those tonight, not all of them, but it's actually quite substantial. There's about 20 sections that you'll see in your ordinance in 2 weeks, in addition to the new section, which is 1710-390. It's the very last one listed on this slide. So be prepared for a somewhat lengthy ordinance. So the first section that the Planning Commission looked at was coming up with a definition for accessory dwelling units. And what they landed on, and again, this is through working with our attorney and looking at other examples from other communities, and trying to identify something that would work in the city of Soldotna. This is what they came up with. It means a subordinate detached dwelling unit which provides basic requirements for living, sleeping, cooking, and sanitation located on a lot or parcel with an existing residence. So one of the key words there is detached, and what you have there is a photo of a detached accessory dwelling unit, and on the lower right is an example of a more traditional two-family dwelling, which is already allowed under this code. So I know some people are concerned when they see that this only deals with detached. We're already allowed, or people are already allowed under our code to add units, whether it's in their basement or a loft or an add-on to an existing dwelling unit, provided it's allowed within that zoning district. And I didn't say this, but please stop me if you have questions as we go along.
That's what I'm going to do right now.
Okay.
Is there going to be a minimum lot size?
So there is a standard that's being proposed that basically says an ADU cannot be placed on a lot that is non-conforming. So it has to meet the minimum lot size within that zoning district. So if the minimum is 8,400 square feet, and they've got 8,400 square feet, they can build an ADU.
Okay, will there be a minimum or a maximum size to these units?
That is also proposed of 750 square feet. And I'll go back to your first question, Mayor, and that is there's also something in the code that requires a maximum amount of coverage. So you can have your 8,400 square feet of lot, but our code says you can't cover more than 30% of it in structures. And so that'll be more limiting than the lot size itself. And so, and I've got an example of that as we go a little further here that hopefully will answer that question a little bit better. The next 4 slides cover the question of where should these be allowed. And basically, the Planning Commission is answered they should be allowed in all of our residential zoning districts. So this is the first one, single-family residential. And those green blobs are the actual lots within the single-family zoning district. There's about 22 lots only in this district. It's very small, and it's located right in the heart of our residential district off of Corral Street. In this case, for the single-family residential district, the code language that would be inserted into the section would be what you see on the screen there. Accessory dwelling units are permitted, provided they comply with the special requirements found in this new section 1710-390, as well as in the old section of code that dealt with accessory uses, and that's 305. So single-family residential is the first one that they are saying they should be allowed in. The second district is the single-family, two-family district. And as you can see from the green lots, this is a much more substantial district within our community. There's over 1,000 lots that are zoned this way. But the language that you see up there is exactly the same from the single family to the single family two family. Same for the multifamily, the exact same language. And same for the rural residential, number 2 under the rural residential. So those are the 4 zoning districts where it's being proposed to allow for accessory dwelling units. This one, rural residential, is a little bit unique in that we're also recommending a housekeeping change here, and that's in item 1. And you'll see there, underlined, camping is limited to 2 tents or RV units for a maximum of 30 days within 1 calendar year. Currently, that language sits in the rural residential district in the principal uses and structures. And that's different than every other residential zoning district where camping is viewed as an accessory use. And I'm not sure why it was put in the principal use for rural residential, but this puts it back as an accessory use. So that's just an aside and a housekeeping item. There's a couple other housekeeping items as well that we'll get to. So accessory dwelling units, purpose and intent. So we talked a little bit about purpose and intent, and this is the actual code language that is being proposed for the ADU section. And it states that the purpose and intent of this section is to set standards for accessory dwelling units, to allow more efficient use of housing and infrastructure, to respond to changing family needs, and to provide a broader range of housing types. And then the second bullet point, or the second item, basically states that if you want to build an ADU, you have to submit a site plan, and you have to have a building permit and a zoning permit. So those are the first 2 sections of this new section of code of 1710-390. Once we get past those, we move into general standards, and this there's quite a few of them, and so I'll run through them as briefly as I can. So the first, again, states where they are allowed and where they're not allowed, and this is, we've already covered that, all of the residential zoning districts. The second basically states that they are not allowed on a lot with a duplex if you're in the single-family, 2-family district. So if you've already got 2 units and you're in a district that limits you to 2 units, having a 3rd unit may be excessive, especially if we're talking about a lot that's 8,400 square feet and you've already got 2 units and you add a 3rd and you're thinking about parking and those types of things, it can get crowded. Third, requires that there already be a habitable dwelling present on the lot. So again, we're talking about accessory dwelling units. They're accessory to the principal use. So in this case, it's requiring that we have an existing dwelling on the lot. Fourth, accessory dwelling units are permitted only on lots, tracts, or parcels that meet the zoning district's minimum lot size requirements. That's something that the mayor just asked about. So the lot has to be conforming before an ADU could be built.
John, can I add one comment
Sure.
to that? At least internally in the discussions we had as staff, we did model different thresholds. One of the questions we asked was the same as, should this be allowed on different sizes? And Jen in our planning department produced some maps. What if it was only 1 acre and above? What if it was 20,000 square feet and above? And I think that we became disinterested in that idea in part from an equity standpoint, in that as you start to sort lots by lot size, it starts to become an opportunity that really felt like it would be only available to wealthier neighborhoods, larger established lots. And I think then our sense of ADUs was that they would feel appropriate even in a more dense, smaller lot neighborhood. But that was just something else I wanted to add. It wasn't necessarily intended as kind of an extra perk for larger lot owners, but something that can provide more affordable housing, potentially in a much broader sense.
Yeah, thank you. The 5th item is the other item that I mentioned about lot coverage. All of our residential zoning districts say that you can't have more than 30% of the lot covered in buildings. And so this reiterates that. And to give you an idea here, I took one of our smaller lots at 0.22 acres or about 9,000 square feet. And if you put a 1,700 square foot home on that, that's about 18% of the lot. With a 750 square foot ADU, that coverage then increases to 25%, but it's still under the 30%. So there's room, even on our smaller lots, to build ADUs and still meet our zoning requirements. The sixth item basically states that a building permit is required. The seventh states that 750 shall be the size of an accessory dwelling unit. And that, we talked about at length, both as staff and at the planning commission level, and went back and forth. We also looked at other communities to see what they were doing. Girdwood, for example, has two standards. They've got one at 600 square feet and one at 750 square feet, depending on the size of the lot they sit on. Portland is at 800 square feet. Anchorage is at 900 square feet, or 75% of the principal dwelling. So there's different ways to do this and measure this. And there wasn't consensus at the Planning and Zoning Commission. Some felt a little bit higher, some a little bit lower, some had this method. And in the end, 750 was kind of the safe middle ground that everybody was comfortable with. And that's where we ended up with regard to size.
Question. You have a residential lot that has a detached garage. Can that ADU then be attached to the garage upwards?
Yes, it may. And in that situation, you wouldn't count the garage part as part of the ADU. You would only use the square footage of the space above it that's actually occupied as a dwelling unit.
Okay.
Let's see, I think I was on yard setbacks, and this one basically states that setbacks are to be maintained. B states that if you're going to build an ADU, it either needs to be 10 feet behind the front plane of the principal dwelling unit, or at least 60 feet back from the front lot line. So there's two different ways to do this. In most cases, we believe that the dwelling unit's going to be located behind the structure. In most cases, there isn't enough room to put an accessory dwelling unit in front. But there are some instances, especially in the rural residential district, where we've got larger lots and we've got homes that are set back a little bit farther into the woods, where things like neighborhood character wouldn't be an issue if the accessory dwelling unit was in front rather than behind. So this provides a little bit of flexibility.
Another question. You may have already answered this. Can there be more than one ADU unit on a particular lot if the lot is a large lot?
No. So this, as proposed, it's stating only one ADU per parcel. And then the last one under yard setbacks is accessory dwelling units taller than 15 feet shall be set back at least 10 feet from side lot lines. Currently, our side lot line setback is 5 feet. And so here too, it was felt that if you're going to build something taller than 15 feet, just create a little more space between you and your neighbor for those structures so that you're not either shading out or crowding your neighbor.
How would that apply if it was a unit being established on top of like a detached garage?
That's a good question. If that garage was located 5 feet off the side lot line, yeah, that's something we'll have to think about and make a note on here. I'll see if it may be. I mean, right now the answer would be it wouldn't be allowed. That would be the answer. But if that's something that we want to try to pursue and make an exception for, then we can talk about that. Continuing on with general standards. Parking. So this slide can really be distilled down to a couple things. One is that one parking space is required for each accessory dwelling unit. You can't park on the front lawn or where landscaping might be required. And it also encourages the use of common driveways rather than the construction of new driveways, and requires paving if a driveway is expanded or created to serve an ADU if that lot is accessed by a paved street. So that's the paving and parking section of, or standards. Utilities. So 10 basically allows for the ADU to connect to utilities off of the principal structure. And this historically has been the roadblock to accessory dwelling units in the city, because our code under our Title 13 does not allow for us to split or link into, it requires basically a separate service for each dwelling unit. And what this is stating is that you will now be allowed to do that, and there will also be, as you'll see coming up here, some modifications to Title 13 that provide an exception for ADUs so that they can share the water and sewer services. 11 states that accessory dwelling units can't be placed within the Kenai River Overlay District. 12 states that if you are going to have a short-term rental, at least one of the units on the parcel has to be owner-occupied. 13, you need to have an address. 14, if you have an ADU, you can't divide or sell it. So considering it's likely, or it will be in almost all cases, I would believe, connected to the same set of services, the water and sewer, what we don't want is to have those parcels or those homes separated at some point. Yeah.
Thanks for letting me interrupt. I want to go back to 12, because we spent a lot of time talking about that as staff, and I think our code is fairly permissive in terms of allowing short-term rentals. We didn't set a cap on how many homes in a neighborhood could be used as short-term rentals, even if they're not owner-occupied. And so as we were thinking through kind of policy considerations of allowing more smaller housing types in our neighborhoods, at least I think it was important that at the staff level we settled on this concept where we didn't think it would be appropriate in our neighborhoods for a home to be on a lot and an ADU to be on a lot, and both of them to be short-term rentals where there's no long-term owners or renters. So that term owner-occupied, do we use that term owner-occupied? We do. It doesn't actually have to mean owner. It does mean that someone has to be long-term renters, or does it actually have to be owner-occupied, John? Sorry, I'm asking this question now that I'm saying it out loud. Because we also had a lot of discussion about that. Could you have a 12 months of the year renters who are long-term established tenants in the home and then use the ADU as kind of an Airbnb, or do we want the property owner themselves to have to occupy one of those?
Yeah, I do remember that discussion. And I don't, we didn't have that level of discussion with the Planning Commission as to whether it has to be owner-occupied or whether it could just be one long-term renter and one short-term renter. So that was not addressed by the Planning Commission.
So we'll think about that and maybe bring it back for the council's discussion. I know traditionally, from our perspective, long-term renters is equivalent to owners living in a home in terms of neighborhood character and stability. It's really once you start nightly, weekly rentals that we pay more attention to how that impacts the character of a neighborhood.
So
If there's a owner-occupied home and they have the ADU, can they have a long-term rental on that ADU?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Mr. Mayor, if I may. So my question being is, how are we going to be making efforts to make these rental units as ADUs pop up? I shouldn't say rental units. What kind of efforts would we be making or changes to kind of steer some of these new ADUs to being used for the purpose of long-term rentals or permanent housing. Because I think the goal here is to make housing more accessible and more abundant in the city. And my fear is that if we don't address this from the beginning, we're just going to see an abundance of ADUs pop up and just, oh, now they're all on VRBO and Airbnb, and we've done nothing to address housing in the city other than just we have a lot more short-term rentals all over the place. Just out of curiosity, I got on Zillow today, and if you look around, there's nothing in the city for long-term rentals available right now. Very few options. You look at Airbnb in the city, it's a stark difference. There are so many Airbnb units in the city as compared to current long-term rental options. And what's even more scary to me about the Airbnb situation is the majority of the Airbnb rentals, they look like single-family homes. These are properties that should be going to long-term rentals and families as a place to stabilize in our community. And I don't want to see this take off, and now we have ADUs all over the place, and we've done nothing to help out long-term rentals and address that need. So I guess, how would you respond to that?
I would say this is the section of code that we just covered, that if you would want to see changes with regard to short-term rentals, this is the section that we would want to modify if that's the direction the council wants to go.
So as this is currently being presented, there's nothing to steer that in that direction. We would need to make some kind of amendment to do that.
Yeah, this basically allows for short-term rental, and as it's currently written, the other unit, one of the two units, it could be that the owner lives in the accessory dwelling unit and rents the main house, or it could be that the owner lives in the house and rents the the ADU. Could go either way under the way this is written. But it's certainly, this is the section that if you want to direct that, and, we're certainly open to having that conversation and trying to come up with some language that potentially could meet your needs.
Okay, I will probably be following up with you on
I
that
think,
then.
John, I'll just add to that. I think there's really two considerations. One is within the context of these ADUs, do we want them to be allowed to be rented as short-term rentals or not? I would suggest it's probably appropriate to check back in general on short-term rentals. I brought this so I could reference it, and I'll email a copy to the council, but the current version of the Alaska Economic Times has an article about short-term rentals, and on the Kenai Peninsula, they're reporting 7% of our housing stock is currently short-term rentals. And that number shocked the economists because it's unique. We're more than twice the rate of any other location in the state of Alaska. And so this idea of how does that impact affordability, how does it impact housing stock, I think it's probably a conversation we should have more broadly even before people start building ADUs. So Ashlyn, I'm going to give you this copy, and then I'm going to email the council with that article because we've known anecdotally that there are many of these types of rentals in town, but I think people are starting to put more of a fine point on the data and maybe some of those impacts.
Sure.
And that's and I bring that up because that's a separate section of code. We do have the short-term rental section of code, which if the city was looking at how many is okay, that section would also be appropriate to take a look at.
Right, and when we first discussed that code, we were talking about concepts like how many in a given area, not more than 3 within 500 feet of each other or something to that effect. We were exploring different things, but at the time it was decided, well, let's see how this thing plays out. And as Stephanie indicated, they have grown. We did some research in the planning department, and Jen found 62 listings of short-term rentals in the city of Soldotna. That represents 51 properties, but 62 listings. There's a number of parcels that have multiple buildings for rent. And then the borough identified another 12 that we had not found. So I calculated about 74 short-term rentals. And if you look at that, just over the 1,000+ parcels I mentioned, we're at that 7% kind of number. So it's just about right on.
What is considered a short-term rental? How long?
I'm trying to remember now. I believe it's under 30 days.
Under 30 days. Because we do have a lot of what I consider short-term rentals. When you get through with the summer of everybody coming in to fish, and you have those cabins that are rented for 6-8 months. So they would not be considered, they'd be considered a long-term.
Correct.
Thank you.
I didn't hear you well. Did you say under 30 or did you say 130?
30.
30.
Yep.
And John, can I go back before you get too far forward?
Sure.
I just had two things that struck me. So in your previous slide, when you addressed the paving requirements of the driveway when you have an ADU, I don't know our zoning code off the top of my head, so help me. Do we require paving of a driveway currently? Or is this something that, for instance, if they had a dirt driveway at this time and they add an ADU, they would be required to pave the entire driveway? Am I understanding that requirement correctly?
And paving is only required in the commercial district if they're accessing a paved road. In that circumstance, they would be required to pave, but not currently in the residential district.
And did I interpret that correctly? They would be required to pave if they had an ADU?
If they were to, not, if they have, let me make sure I'm reading this correctly. It's only required for an expansion of an existing driveway or development of a new driveway.
So if they had the required parking space currently in code +1, that would be not required?
Correct.
Okay. And then the second question I had for you was on your next slide, just where the code pointed out that you needed a separate physical address. And my question just on that one, because we're talking about accessory dwelling units potentially being, behind a primary structure or anything like that. Is there anything in our current code or maybe later in this section that talks about the display requirements of that address? So I'm thinking about first responder access, obviously for a unit that might be behind a main house. Would they have to sign that in any certain way? Do they have to post it? Was that ever discussed at P&Z?
It was not discussed, and I don't know our addressing code well enough without looking at it to say whether there's anything in there that requires display of the address in a certain way.
I think there is, John, yeah. So it's called numbering buildings, because we don't assign an address to a lot, you assign it to structures. And there is something in that section currently, it's in the building code, not in the zoning code, that specifies if the structure's a certain distance, then the number shall be displayed kind of at the end of the driveway is the concept.
Okay.
And so it'd be important, as you mentioned, for a public safety standpoint, that each of these units be individually identified, but also if they're obscured and far back, that access to that also be identified. We could take another look at that.
Yeah, we can look at that, and that specific language could be amended to include reference to that code requirement.
Yeah, if it's not in there now, I'd be interested in looking at what that language would look like. Thank you.
Could they technically still use the same address and just do it like they do in an apartment building, Unit 1, Unit 2, or A, B, whatever?
Yes, that's a possibility. We'd have to look specifically at our code, and I believe our addressing code needs a little refinement anyway, but there are certain things that the code looks at when it assigns either an A, B, or C, or a separate address altogether. It depends on how the building is accessed and those types of things. But yes, adding an ABC or suite 1, 2, or 3, those kinds of things are allowable. Let's see. Where did we leave off here? Yeah, I think I was on 13 maybe? No, 14. Okay, going back. ADU may not be divided or sold apart from the principal dwelling. Oh, okay, 15. A mobile home, recreational vehicle or travel trailer shall not be used as an ADU. So it's stating what's not an ADU. And then 16 states that an ADU has to have a permanent building foundation. And that takes care of the general standards as proposed and takes us to some of the other sections, which I'll just briefly go over. There's a section on standards for when a permit would expire. Basically that if somebody applied for a permit and they didn't use it within 18 months, that permit would expire. Or if the ADU is altered in some way that it's no longer conforming to the code, the permit would expire. And then last is if they don't maintain their parking, the permit would expire. Variances are not permitted under this section. variances are intended really when requirements of the code would deprive somebody of reasonable use of their property. So if a dwelling already exists on the lot, then reasonable use exists and a variance could not be granted. So this basically states that variances under this section of code would not be able to be granted.
I have another question. What happens in a change of ownership? How would you handle that?
In what respect? Just,
The primary building, they sell the building.
Right.
And there's a new owner. Does the variance or your permits or whatever change?
oh, yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, the variance, or not the variance, the ADU would run with the land, the permit for an accessory dwelling unit. So as ownership changes and the new owner comes on, that permit remains valid, provided all the standards are met. There's also a section on violations, and what this does is recommends a fine of $250 if someone fails to obtain an ADU permit or is unlawfully operating an ADU.
Brings up another question.
Sure.
A sales tax applied to those rentals, the ADU rental, and then how is the collection going to take place?
So when someone applies for the permit itself, one of the things that we require is that they be in conformance with the sales tax codes at the borough level. So they have to become registered to collect sales tax, just as they would with any other rental. So they would be working with the borough first to become registered and then to collect and submit sales tax for their renters.
And then go back to my last question, then, if there's a change in ownership, how does the borough know, or how do we know that that's been corrected?
The only way we would know is through notification, and we do get notified on a monthly basis of changes of property use. So what we do now is we sort those by type. So depending on whether they're, for example, on the river, or if they're a business, or if they're residential, they get different letters from us. We provide them basically a welcome to Soldotna, if you will, type letter saying, thank you for locating in the city. You may not know this, but you're located in the commercial zoning district, and the uses typically allowed in that district are this, this, and this. And some of the issues or concerns that people have voiced are this, this, and this, and please contact us if you have questions. So that would be one way that we could potentially track if an ADU sells. We would first have the permit. We would know that there's that activity occurring there, and then when we get the notification, we could try to bring that new person into compliance with the sales tax requirements.
And I know that everyone in Soldotna is totally legal at all times, and so I want that as an absolute premise. What is your sense in terms of covert violations of this?
Of accessory dwelling units?
Yes, sir.
I think there's some occurring. I don't know the extent of it. I feel, as we discussed earlier about short-term rentals, I feel that that's much more common than people constructing accessory dwelling units. So I don't have an honest opinion for you as far as how many are out there or how often they're being constructed. To do them right, it will create, it's an expense. It's an expensive. If people are skirting the law and putting people up in sheds, then there's some serious safety issues there that we would want to correct and make sure that wherever people are living, that they're safe and in a secure, secure dwelling. But unfortunately, I don't know if, Stephanie, you have any idea or feel for?
No, I mean, neighbors do a good job of keeping us informed of what's happening in their area where they live. And so I would expect that if there are properties where additional dwellings have arisen, it's probably on our more rural, more remote parcels. But the borough, from an assessing standpoint, I think has some fairly sophisticated technology to locate structures. So if a new structure was on a property anywhere in Soldotna, whether it was a pole barn or a garage or potentially another dwelling, I think the borough assessing department would identify that, and it potentially could bring things to light that way as well.
Follow up, if I could, Mr. Mayor? Follow up? Would it be appropriate to assume that the city is increasing their vigilance on this issue? Is this a new thing that we're concerned about? Or we're just going through, we're updating everything?
Yeah, I would say that we're certainly keeping our eyes out. You know, we've got a new building official, and as we see new construction, we try to address it, and we try to find out what's going on and make sure that the proper permits are issued and that a safe, habitable structure is being constructed. So in that respect, you know, we're certainly being vigilant, but again, I don't see as many of these going on. I think this is more of this ordinance would provide an opportunity for people to take that step to develop and build something legally under our code. Because currently, right now, it's very difficult, if not impossible. As I think you may have came in a couple minutes late, and we had talked briefly about how our existing code only allows for the construction of a detached unit currently that can only have up to one bedroom and no rent can be charged. That's the only circumstance where an existing accessory dwelling unit can be constructed. And we know historically there's been a lot of interest in this. So are those types of things being constructed? I don't know, but this certainly will provide a legal method for people to construct accessory dwelling units and hopefully have them constructed in a safe way.
Thank you.
I have two questions. Number one, you said the fine is $250. One time $250, or do you assess it every week or every month as they don't comply?
So all of our fines under the minor offense section of code are daily fines. Okay. And so and in most cases, a single day fine is all that's assessed and try to.
Okay. And my second question is, we have exemptions for seniors on their homes, but those exemptions are not supposed to take effect if they are using their property commercially. Is this going to be considered commercial, and would they lose their exemption?
I'm not aware of that requirement that the commercial use, but I would consider this to be a commercial use if you're renting out
Well,
a space.
I'm referring to people that have homes along the river. They are seniors, they get the exemption, but I also know that they have people that stay with them and pay them. But it doesn't get reported to the borough. So again, this is, if you're going to actually build a building that you're going to rent, what is that going to do to their exemption?
Yeah, I don't know how the borough, I would imagine the borough would still provide the exemption for their principal structure. Whether, how they explain away the accessory dwelling unit to the borough, I don't know.
Yeah, because it's going to increase the assessment for that piece of property. Just like right now, if you have other structures on your property, it's all bagged as one.
Right. The next section that I've got for you is what I mentioned earlier, and I've got just a handful of slides. They all basically say the same thing here. Basically what it says is that a separate water service connection, or in the next slides, a separate sewer service connection shall be provided for each separate residential or commercial structure. And then there's the new language, except for accessory dwelling units approved under section 1710-390 of Soldotna Municipal Code. So this is the section of code that needed to be amended in our utility section to provide for these ADUs to be constructed and be linked in to our, to be linked with the principal structures, water and sewer lines.
John, I'll just add to that. We typically wouldn't allow multiple structures to be interconnected. That's most important if there's going to be multiple owners. So we don't want the person who lack of payment is first in line for us to have to shut off 3 structures to deal with that one owner. In this case, we're protected against that because there's one owner. There's one person that owns the entire property. They might be renting to somebody here and living or renting to somebody in this other structure, but there's one property owner responsible for that bill. There's one property owner who would be impacted for that scenario I described. And as John mentioned previously, there's a provision being recommended that would not allow this to be subdivided off. That's an important provision in connection with this. So if we're going to allow these structures to be intertied, not have their own service lines to the main, then it's important that they stay in that common ownership and not someday down the road be 2 separate properties, 2 separate owners. So those requirements are interlinked.
I don't know if you can answer this question, but I'm not sure that Homer Electric or NSTAR would permit something like not having a direct line for their HEA line or their gas line to that ADU. And if they're separate units, I'm not quite sure how you would set up, you know, the wiring from one unit to the next unit or the gas line from the main structure to the next one.
I think most of the utilities will allow strictly under common ownership the extension of those utilities, much like we're allowing now, if it's common ownership and after the meter. So you can have a sub-panel. The detached garage, for example, would have power and gas and et cetera, always coming after the utilities meter and put in by the customer, not by HEA. So if you wanted to have a separate meter, or if you wanted to, you know, if you wanted to rent this thing out and somebody else was in charge of, you put the burden of those services costs on the renter, it would need a separate meter probably.
Well, let me ask you this then. You got gas heat and you got a gas line running into the main residence.
Mhm.
And you're going to have a new heating unit in the attached one. Is NSTAR going to allow you to run a line then from that house to the next, the ADU?
They will. They may require, anytime you have gas service, you'll calculate the amount of BTUs that are going to need to be consumed by your different gas devices. So then they may require, best practice, a building code would require, our building permit would require that you calculate that and that the gas service and the meter is sufficient to supply the needed volume of BTUs to run that heating unit. So typically it is allowed with some permitting.
And emergency shutoffs for both of them?
As required by building code. So it depends. Certain, manufacturers have certain things that are built in, but as required by the IRC or IBC. Yep. It'll have to be completely code compliant. And I was going to also note that this section is also indicative of this being more opportunistic to our community than chasing down existing use or some fly-by-night situations. Certainly some of it may be occurring, but this is an obstacle that we've encountered from folks wishing to have mother-in-law apartments or detached type facilities to accommodate more residential use. And as it exists today in code, it's generally cost prohibitive to cut into the street and sidewalk and curb and gutter 10 feet down for sewer, 11 feet down for water, just to provide those amenities to this detached unit, whatever it may be. And that has been an obstruction to a lot of this stuff happening in our community. So this will certainly be an opportunity for folks that want to do it.
And so there's just a couple slides, but they all say the same thing both with the water service and with the, in this case, the sewer service, basically providing that exception for accessory dwelling units. So I won't spend additional time on that. As I mentioned, there are a couple housekeeping items. We do already have a section on accessory uses in our code, section 305. Within this section, there's a few things that we're recommending be changed. The first one, all accessory structures shall comply with the standards of the zoning code. So that one repeats what number 5 states. So we don't need both of them, so we're recommending we eliminate number 1. Number 2 is just a poorly constructed sentence, and we are recommending that a period be placed and that it be made abundantly clear as to how height will be measured for accessory structures. And number 3 is that section of code that I've been mentioning a couple times now about currently. It states that within a couple of zoning districts, structures may include a single detached building to provide housing for relatives or temporary quarters for guests only, where no charge is made for the use of the quarters, and the building may contain no more than 1 bedroom. So that would be stricken, and the new ADU code would be adopted in its place.
Go back to number 2 for a second, which seems contradictory to what you said earlier, is that the ADU couldn't be more than 15 feet high.
No, that's if it's over 15 feet high, it has to be moved a little farther back.
Okay.
The next one, number of buildings per lot. So this one, basically, if you look at this one, you'll see that there's already, the new language would be underlined, and the existing language is the remainder. And there's already a number of lots, or I'm sorry, of zoning districts that are mentioned here where you can't build more than 1 building containing a principal use on a single lot of record. What we're recommending is that rural residential be added to that list. And then also the words unless authorized through other provisions of the code, because there are other provisions of the code like the planned unit development section, the PUD section, that would allow for additional buildings to be constructed. This is being changed because we've had an example of this being really exploited. Luckily, it didn't go through, but what we had was a 20-acre parcel in the rural residential district. And as our code currently reads, if you have the rural residential district, it requires a 1-acre lot. And what the code currently states is that in the rural res district, for every 1 acre that you have, you can build an additional principal structure. So in this case, what was being proposed was numerous buildings within the rural residential district, within the single lot, without going through any type of review process. And that is a loophole, like in this particular case, was problematic in that it was a challenging lot. Access was a problem. Topography was a problem. It really needed review. And so what we're recommending is that rural residential be similar to the other zoning districts and be limited to a single principal use on a lot. If you want to build more than 1 lot, or if you want to build more than 1 building on a rural residential structure, there is the opportunity to do a planned unit development, which is an alternative way to develop your land. There's also the possibility where if you do have a 20-acre parcel, you can subdivide it and create standard 1-acre lots and build all the structures that you would like to. So that's that housekeeping item.
Question? Would you assume that by doing this, will those who are maybe already, I'll say in violation, will they be allowed because, again, sort of ex post facto, or is this going to cause a number of people to now be in noncompliance and therefore a problem?
If there exists where there's multiple buildings on a rural residential lot, they would become legally non-conforming. So they would be allowed to continue.
Okay. Do you think there are many? And I don't know what many means either, if you ask that.
I think there's some. especially in the eastern part of town. I think there's a few with multiple principal dwellings. There's also instances where perhaps lodges had been built with cabins that have been converted into long-term lodging or long-term rentals. So it's a mix, but I don't think there's a lot.
With the change in ownership, would that legal noncompliance then have to come into compliance?
It would not.
Would not have?
It would not, no.
Thank you.
And then the very last, speaking of planned unit developments, the last housekeeping item is there's a list of districts where planned unit developments are allowed. They're an effective way to manage larger developments that may not otherwise fit within our traditional zoning codes. Mountain Rose is a good example of where a planned unit development was done in Soldotna and worked very well. But right now, what you see before you is the list of zoning districts where they're allowed. Commercial is not included, and we're recommending that commercial be included. Our downtown plan includes recommendations that we include housing in our downtown, include mixed-use type developments. And so this would provide a tool for them within the commercial district to do those types of developments. I believe, yes, that was the last slide. So I'd be happy to answer if there's additional questions, be happy to do that. And within 3 minutes, I'm happy about that.
I'll try and keep it within 3 minutes. 2 quick questions for you. First of all, when we talk about these planned unit developments, I didn't see anything, unless it's already addressed in our code. Has there been any discussion about the potential aesthetics of these structures? And so I guess what I'm asking here is, you know, if I put up a building that maybe is not as nice looking as the primary use, or where I'm going to have a neighbor come and say, well, this is ugly or it detracts from the neighborhood. Was that discussed at all, or is that addressed in our code in other places? I just didn't see it mentioned today.
It's not addressed in our code, but the Planning Commission did actually have a work session, probably 8-10 months ago, where they did look at aesthetics, and they looked at specifically building frontages that face the traffic. And there was new development in town that created an interest at the Planning Commission level that where they wanted to, you know, look at how are other communities dealing with this, and other communities have developed standards for frontages for buildings that have a single frontage, that have multiple frontages, and that was the case where the Planning Zoning Commission was interested, was that a building had been constructed with multiple frontages, and the front facade of the building really didn't face the street. And so there are options out there. There is an ability to regulate that, but I think we would need some direction from council to pursue something like that.
You did, you did find some code language that seemed to require the ADU to match the principal home in terms of aesthetics. And I know at least in your early drafts, we had reviewed some of that language. I think we had some concerns about precision, interpretation of that. It was very subjective language. And so I don't know if that was in the draft that made it to the Planning Commission, but there was discussion about whether ADUs should be required through some statement in the code to look like the principal dwelling in terms of color and aesthetics.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there was, excuse me, and sorry for getting off course on commercial development. But with regard to ADUs, there was some discussion with the Planning Commission with regard to aesthetics. They were more general terms. They weren't specific standards. They were essentially goals of the ordinance to have a compatible structure so that the ADU was compatible with the principal structure. And the Planning Commission felt it was very subjective and asked how that would ever be implemented and how could you enforce that and without some type of meaningful standards. And so it was the recommendation to remove those subjective statements with regard to character and kind of the visual continuity between the principal structure and the accessory structure.
And I guess just for the record, I'm not sure I'm a proponent of that or not, but I can certainly see the issue arising with, different construction and those types of things. So just curious about that. And then just for a point of clarification, so I make sure I know, but with the exception of the housekeeping items that you showed in the accessory structure code that exists, these changes don't affect accessory structures that aren't habitable units. So your storage sheds and things, with maybe the exception of the land cover limit, there's no change to that with this ordinance. Is that correct?
Yeah, you're correct.
Okay, thank you.